The blizzard had raged for 3 days, dropping temperatures to 40 below zero, and Silas Blackwood stood shivering at Werner Hauptmann's door, his own cabin now uninhabitable despite a fire that had burned continuously for 72 hours. Inside, Werner sat comfortably in shirt sleeves beside a stove that hadn't been lit in 18 hours. The interior a steady 68 degrees, while Silas's cabin barely reached 20. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. Werner Hauptmann had survived 7 winters in the Montana wilderness, trapping beaver along the tributaries that fed into the Yellowstone River. He was methodical, cautious, and remarkably competent at the dangerous work of extracting pelts from frozen streams while avoiding the countless ways the frontier killed careless men. But competence and caution could only protect against so much. The winter of 1852 would teach Werner that survival required more than skill with traps and rifles. He had come to America in 1844, leaving Bavaria at age 19 with little more than his father's tools and the knowledge of masonry he had absorbed during 5 years as an apprentice. His father, Johann Hauptmann, had been a master mason in the town of Regensburg, specializing in the massive tile stoves that heated homes throughout the Alpine regions. Werner had grown up watching his father build these structures, learning the mathematics of thermal mass and the physics of heat retention without ever calling it by those names. He simply knew that a well-built stove could warm a house through brutal Alpine winters with a fraction of the wood that open fireplaces consumed. But America offered no work for specialists in Bavarian heating technology. Werner had drifted west with thousands of other immigrants, eventually finding his way to the fur trade as beaver populations in the Rockies still offered profitable opportunities for men willing to risk everything. He partnered with Ernst Hoffmann in 1849, another German immigrant who had come west 2 years earlier. They established a trapping operation along a remote creek system in what would later become southwestern Montana Territory, far from established settlements and trading posts. Their partnership worked well. Ernst was gregarious where Werner was reserved, optimistic where Werner was analytical. They built a standard log cabin in the fall of 1849, notched corners and mud chinking, a simple stone fireplace, one small window. It took them 4 days to construct. The cabin kept out wind and rain adequately. It provided shelter from the elements. That seemed sufficient. The winter of 1850 to 1851 tested that assumption. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero for weeks at a time. The fireplace consumed enormous quantities of wood, but provided heat only within a few feet of the flames. The far corners of the cabin remained near freezing. They slept in their furs and woke to find water frozen in cups beside their beds. Ernst developed a persistent cough that lasted through February. But they survived, and when spring arrived with its profitable trapping season, the hardships of winter faded into accepted reality. Werner never forgot the cold, though. He remembered his childhood home in Regensburg, where his family's tile stove kept every room comfortable, even when snow piled 3 feet deep outside. The winter of 1851 began with unusual severity. Snow arrived in early October, weeks earlier than normal, and temperatures plunged with a ferocity that worried even experienced mountain men. Werner and Ernst had prepared adequately, stockpiling firewood and provisions, securing their trap lines before the ground froze solid. They settled into their cabin, expecting the usual hardships of frontier winter life. By mid-November, Ernst's cough had returned. It started as a minor irritation, something he dismissed with characteristic optimism. But the cough deepened over the following weeks, becoming wet and painful. Ernst began running fevers. Werner tried every remedy he knew, boiling pine needle tea, keeping Ernst warm near the fireplace, rationing their precious whiskey for its supposed medicinal properties. Nothing helped. The cabin stayed brutally cold, despite a fire that burned continuously. Werner fed logs into the fireplace every 2 hours throughout the day and night, watching helplessly as most of the heat vanished up the chimney while Ernst shivered under every fur and blanket they owned. The fireplace threw heat directly forward, leaving the walls and floor frozen. Cold radiated from every surface except the immediate area in front of the flames. On December 3rd, Ernst's fever spiked dangerously high. He became delirious, speaking in German about his childhood in Hamburg, calling for his mother, not recognizing Werner during his lucid moments. Werner stayed awake for 48 hours straight, maintaining the fire, trying to keep his partner warm, watching helplessly as pneumonia consumed Ernst's strength. Ernst Hoffmann died on December 5, 1851, in a cabin that was barely warmer than the frozen wilderness outside, despite a roaring fire. Werner sat beside his friend's body for hours, listening to wind howl through gaps in the chinking, feeling cold air seep through the log walls, understanding with absolute clarity that this cabin had failed its most basic purpose. Shelter meant nothing if it couldn't protect against cold. Walls meant nothing if they couldn't retain heat. He buried Ernst 2 days later on a hillside overlooking the creek, breaking frozen ground with a pickaxe, piling stones to mark the grave. The temperature stood at 25 below zero. Werner worked methodically, his mind already turning over a problem that would obsess him for the next 8 months. That night, alone in the cabin, Werner fed the fire and watched flames consume wood with terrible inefficiency. He thought about his father's tile stove in Regensburg, how it had kept their entire house warm for 24 hours from a single morning firing. He thought about the massive clay structure that had stood in the corner of their kitchen, radiating gentle heat from every surface. He thought about the physics his father had explained during those apprentice years, how thermal mass absorbed heat and released it slowly, how properly designed flue paths could capture warmth that would otherwise escape. Ernst had died because this cabin couldn't stay warm. That simple fact changed everything Werner thought he understood about survival in the wilderness. Werner spent the weeks following Ernst's death continuing his trapping work alone, checking lines, processing pelts, maintaining the routine that kept men sane during isolated winters. But his mind remained fixed on the problem of heat. Every time he returned to the cabin and fed the insatiable fireplace, every time he woke shivering. Despite a fire that had burned all night, every time he calculated the enormous quantity of wood he consumed to maintain barely tolerable temperatures, he thought about Bavaria. His father's workshop in Regensburg had contained detailed drawings of tile stove designs, some passed down through 3 generations of Hauptmann masons. Werner had studied those drawings as a boy, learning to read the cross-sections that showed internal flue paths, understanding how hot exhaust gases traveled through serpentine channels inside the stove's mass before finally exiting through the chimney. The longer the path, the more heat transferred from the gases into the surrounding clay and tile. The stove in their family home had stood nearly 7 feet tall, built from fired clay bricks and covered with decorative ceramic tiles. But the beauty was secondary to function. The structure contained hundreds of pounds of clay that absorbed heat during the morning firing. His father would load the firebox with hardwood, burn it hot for 2 to 3 hours, then close the dampers. The fire would consume all its fuel, heating the massive clay structure to temperatures that would burn bare skin. Then the stove would radiate that heat for the next 20 to 24 hours. Werner remembered touching the stove's surface before bed, feeling gentle warmth that never fluctuated, never required tending, never demanded constant fuel. The heat distributed evenly throughout the house because the entire stove became a radiating mass, not a single point source like a fireplace. His father had explained the principle during one of Werner's apprenticeship lessons. Fire generates heat, but most of that heat escapes if you don't capture it. An open fireplace loses 80 to 90% of its heat up. The chimney. The challenge is forcing the heat to transfer into something that will hold it and release it slowly. Clay is perfect for this. It absorbs heat readily, stores tremendous amounts of thermal energy, and radiates that energy gradually over many hours. Werner remembered helping his father build a stove for a wealthy merchant family when he was 16. They had spent 3 weeks on the construction, carefully laying fire bricks to form the combustion chamber, building internal walls that created a maze for exhaust gases, calculating the precise dimensions needed for proper draft. The merchant had questioned the expense and time. His father had simply asked how much wood the merchant wanted to burn each winter. When completed, that stove heated the merchant's entire house with 1/5 the wood his previous fireplaces had consumed. Werner remembered the merchant's amazed expression when he touched the stove's surface 18 hours after the fire had gone out and found it still warm. Now, in a frozen Montana cabin, Werner understood what he needed to build. Spring arrived late in 1852, but when the snow finally melted and streams began flowing freely, Werner emerged from winter isolation with a purpose that bordered on obsession. He continued trapping because he needed income to fund what he was planning, but his attention had shifted. He began visiting other trappers' camps throughout the region, studying their cabins with an analytical intensity that made some men uncomfortable. He examined every heating system he encountered. Most trappers used simple fireplaces, stone or mud construction, identical in principle to what he had built with Ernst. A few had iron stoves, manufactured pieces hauled west at considerable expense. Werner studied these carefully, noting their limitations. The iron absorbed heat quickly and radiated it efficiently, but the metal held no thermal mass. An iron stove was hot, while fire burned inside it and cold, within an hour of the fire dying. He talked to trappers who had survived the brutal winter, asking detailed questions about wood consumption, interior temperatures, comfort levels. Most men accepted cold as inevitable, part of the price for mountain living. They slept in furs, endured frozen mornings, burned whatever wood was necessary. The idea of a truly warm cabin seemed like an impossible luxury. But Werner also found men who had lost partners or nearly died themselves during the worst cold snaps. A trapper named Jacob Mills described waking to find his water bucket frozen solid despite a fire that had burned all night. Another man, Thomas Kerr, had suffered severe frostbite on his feet while sleeping because his cabin's far corner, where his bed sat, never rose above freezing regardless of how much wood he burned. Werner documented everything. He began carrying a small notebook, recording observations about cabin construction, noting which designs failed and how. He measured fireplace dimensions, examined chimney construction, studied how different builders chinked their log walls. A pattern emerged that confirmed what he already suspected. American frontier building techniques prioritized speed and simplicity over thermal efficiency. A cabin was shelter from rain and wind, nothing more. He visited the site where Ernst was buried, standing beside the stone cairn, making a silent promise. What had killed his friend wasn't bad luck or unavoidable tragedy. It was inadequate shelter, and inadequate shelter was a solvable engineering problem. By late May, Werner had developed a clear plan. He would build a proper thermal mass stove, adapting his father's Bavarian designs to frontier conditions and available materials. He had no fired bricks, no ceramic tiles, no manufactured components, but he had clay, sand, and stone. He had his father's knowledge and his own mason's training. Most importantly, he had absolute certainty that what he planned would work. Werner left the mountains in early June, leading 2 pack horses loaded with beaver pelts toward St. Louis. The journey took 3 weeks, following established trails through increasingly settled country. He sold his furs to a trading company for a respectable profit, nearly $400, that represented 7 months of dangerous work. Most trappers would have spent that money on whiskey, women, and supplies before returning to the wilderness within a week. Werner had different priorities. He spent his first 2 days in St. Louis, walking through the industrial district, studying brick kilns and masonry workshops. He watched professional masons working on a warehouse construction project, observing their techniques for laying fire brick and building chimneys. The foreman eventually noticed the bearded mountain man who stood silently watching for hours and approached with suspicion. Werner explained his purpose in accented English, describing what he wanted to build. The foreman's skepticism transformed into interest when Werner sketched a rough cross-section of a Bavarian tile stove in the dirt. The foreman, a German immigrant named Wilhelm Brandt, recognized the design immediately. He had seen similar stoves in his youth in Saxony. He spent an afternoon explaining American building materials and techniques, discussing which principles would translate to frontier conditions and which would require adaptation. Werner filled pages of his notebook with measurements, ratios, and technical details. He visited a tool merchant and spent $35 on specialized equipment, a set of clay-working trowels, a precision level, measuring chains, and metal scribing tools that would allow him to mark exact dimensions. The merchant thought Werner was establishing a masonry business and tried to sell him additional equipment. Werner declined. He needed tools for one stove, not a workshop. At a metallurgical supply warehouse, he purchased items that seemed bizarre for a mountain man's kit: 20 pounds of iron wire, metal brackets designed for reinforcing brick structures, and a specialized thermometer capable of measuring temperatures up to 500 degrees. The clerk asked what possible use a trapper had for a high-temperature thermometer. Werner explained he needed to measure thermal efficiency. The clerk's confusion was obvious, but he accepted Werner's money. Werner spent evenings in a boarding house, converting his father's old tile stove designs to work with frontier materials. He calculated the thermal mass needed to heat a standard trapping cabin. He sketched flue path designs that would maximize heat transfer. He worked through the mathematics of combustion efficiency and heat retention, using principles his father had taught him years ago in Regensburg. He also purchased books, something unusual for a frontiersman: a technical manual on masonry construction, a chemistry text that discussed clay properties and firing temperatures, and a treatise on thermodynamics recently published by a French scientist. The boarding house owner commented that Werner was the most studious trapper she had ever hosted. By late June, Werner had spent nearly $80 on tools, materials, and knowledge. He had detailed plans for adapting Bavarian heating technology to Montana wilderness conditions. He loaded his supplies onto pack horses and began the journey back to the mountains, carrying knowledge that would seem incomprehensible to other trappers. Werner returned to his cabin in mid-July to find everything as he had left it, undisturbed except by weather and animals. He unloaded his supplies and began organizing them with the same methodical attention he applied to everything. The specialized tools were cleaned and stored carefully. His notebooks were placed in a waterproof container. The technical books were wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. Word of his return spread through the scattered trapping community. Within a week, Silas Blackwood arrived at Werner's cabin with 2 other trappers, curious about what Werner had brought back from civilization. Silas was an established mountain man, American-born, confident in his frontier knowledge, and dismissive of immigrant innovations. He had trapped these mountains for 12 years and considered himself an authority on wilderness survival. Silas examined Werner's purchases with undisguised amusement. He picked up the clay-working trowels and asked what possible use Werner had for masonry tools in the wilderness. Werner explained he planned to build a heating stove using principles from his apprenticeship in Bavaria. Silas laughed outright. He pointed to Werner's fireplace and asked what was wrong with stone and fire that had worked for every trapper in the territory. Werner tried to explain thermal mass and heat retention. Silas interrupted, saying he didn't need a lecture from someone who had let his partner freeze to death. The comment was cruel and unfair, but it reflected a common attitude. Ernst's death was seen as Werner's failure to maintain adequate fire, not as evidence that the heating system itself was inadequate. The other trappers examined Werner's thermometer and technical books with confusion. One asked if Werner planned to become a school teacher instead of a trapper. Another suggested the isolation of winter had affected Werner's mind, making him waste money on useless equipment. Silas declared that Werner would realize his mistake when winter came, and he discovered that fancy tools didn't keep a man warm. Werner didn't argue. He had learned during his years in America that some men would only believe what they could see with their own eyes. Words meant nothing against established assumptions. He simply thanked them for visiting and returned to his preparations. After they left, Werner could hear Silas's voice carrying across the creek valley, loudly telling the story of crazy Werner Hauptmann, who thought books and trowels would survive Montana winter. The mockery had begun, and Werner knew it would intensify as his project progressed. He spent the next week scouting locations for clay deposits. He needed specific types of clay, different from the simple mud used for chinking. He searched river banks and cut banks, testing samples by rolling them between his palms, checking plasticity and texture. His father had taught him how to identify good clay by feel, and that knowledge served him now. He found what he needed 3 miles upstream, a deep deposit of gray clay exposed where the creek had undercut its bank during spring flooding. Werner established a camp near the clay deposit and began the laborious process of extraction and testing. He dug into the bank with a spade, removing clay in large chunks that he carried back to his cabin in canvas sacks. Each load weighed 40 to 50 pounds, and the round trip took most of a day. He needed hundreds of pounds of clay for what he planned to build, but quantity alone was insufficient. Clay varied dramatically in quality and properties. Some clay cracked when dried, some lacked the plasticity needed for hand building. Some contained too much organic material that would create weak points. Werner needed to develop a mixture that would survive the thermal stress of repeated heating and cooling cycles while providing maximum thermal mass. He began systematic testing. He mixed clay with sand in varying ratios, from pure clay to half sand and half clay. He added chopped straw to some mixtures, creating a composite material similar to what his father had used. He formed test samples into small bricks, marking each with scratched notes indicating its composition. Then he let them dry for a week in the summer sun. The dried samples revealed immediate problems. Pure clay cracked severely as moisture evaporated. High sand mixtures crumbled when handled. Werner adjusted ratios, adding more or less sand, varying the straw content, testing different drying speeds. He created dozens of sample bricks, each slightly different, each teaching him something about material behavior. After the samples dried completely, Werner subjected them to thermal testing. He built a small fire and placed bricks directly in the flames, monitoring how they responded to intense heat. Some cracked immediately, others seemed stable but crumbled when cooled rapidly. Werner documented every failure, understanding that each unsuccessful mixture taught him what to avoid. He eventually developed a formula that showed promise. 3 parts clay to 1 part coarse sand, with chopped straw added at roughly 10% of total volume. The sand provided structural integrity, preventing the severe cracking that plagued pure clay. The straw created a fiber matrix that gave the material flexibility and resistance to thermal shock. When Werner fired test bricks made from this mixture and then cooled them rapidly, they remained intact. But durability was only one requirement. Werner also needed thermal mass, the material's ability to absorb and store heat. He used his expensive thermometer to conduct tests. He heated sample bricks to 200 degrees in his fireplace, then removed them and monitored how long they stayed warm. The clay-sand-straw composite retained heat for hours, radiating warmth long after being removed from direct flame. He also tested waterproofing. Montana winters brought not just cold, but moisture from snowmelt and humidity. His stove would need to resist water absorption that could cause cracking during freeze-thaw cycles. Werner soaked test bricks in water for 3 days, then monitored them. The mixture showed minimal water absorption and maintained structural integrity when dried again. Werner began construction in early August, starting with the foundation that would support what he planned to build. He knew from calculations that his stove would weigh between 800 and 1,000 pounds when completed. A standard cabin floor, simply packed dirt or loose planks laid across floor joists, could not support that concentrated weight. He needed a proper foundation that would distribute the load and prevent settling that could crack his carefully built structure. He selected a corner of his cabin opposite the existing fireplace, maximizing heat distribution throughout the interior space. Using a spade, he excavated the dirt floor to a depth of 18 inches, creating a pit 4 feet square. The excavation revealed the cabin's floor joists, which were simply logs laid directly on the ground in the standard frontier method. Werner reinforced these by driving additional support posts into the earth beneath where his stove would stand, creating a network of posts spaced every 12 inches. He spent 2 days hauling flat stones from a nearby creek bed, selecting pieces that would stack tightly with minimal gaps. He laid these stones carefully in the excavated pit, creating a solid base that extended below the frost line. Between the stones, he packed his clay mixture, filling every gap to create a monolithic foundation. The result was a stone and clay platform capable of supporting tremendous weight without settling or shifting. Silas Blackwood visited during this phase of construction, bringing 3 other trappers to observe Werner's progress. Silas stood at the edge of the excavation and asked with exaggerated confusion why Werner was building a root cellar inside his cabin. The other men laughed. Werner explained he was creating a foundation for his heating stove. Silas examined the massive stone platform and declared that Werner was wasting a week's labor to support something that should take a day to build. One of the trappers asked how heavy Werner's stove would be if it required such a foundation. Werner explained it would weigh approximately 900 pounds. The trappers exchanged glances of disbelief. Silas stated flatly that no stove needed to weigh 900 pounds, that Werner was clearly building something useless and impractical, and that, come winter, Werner would tear out this ridiculous foundation and build a sensible fireplace like everyone else. Werner continued working without responding to the mockery. He understood that explaining thermal mass principles to men who had never encountered the concept was futile. They saw weight as a problem to be minimized. Werner saw mass as the essential feature that would make his stove function. The fundamental difference in understanding made dialogue impossible. After the trappers left, Werner could hear their voices carrying across the valley as they returned to their camps. Silas's loud declarations about Hauptmann's folly reached Werner clearly. The German was building a stone box inside his cabin. He had wasted money on tools and books. He would freeze next winter while sitting beside his useless monument to immigrant stubbornness. Werner let the foundation cure for 5 days, keeping the clay moist so it would dry slowly without cracking. He used this time to prepare materials for the next phase, processing more clay, cutting straw into precise lengths, organizing his construction sequence. With the foundation fully cured, Werner began building the first level of his stove. This bottom section would serve as a wood storage compartment, keeping fuel dry, while utilizing rising heat from upper levels to pre-warm the wood before burning. The principle was efficiency through integration. Every element of the design served multiple purposes. He started by forming a rectangular box structure directly on the stone foundation, using his clay mixture to create walls 6 inches thick. He worked slowly, building up the walls in layers, allowing each layer to set partially before adding the next. His father had taught him that rushing clay work led to cracking and structural weakness. Patience during construction meant durability for decades afterward. The wood storage compartment's interior dimensions were carefully calculated: 2 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 18 inches tall, large enough to hold several days of fuel, small enough that the stored wood would benefit from passive heat rising through the structure above. Werner formed an arched opening at the front, creating access for loading wood while maintaining structural strength. The arch required careful shaping, using a wooden form that he carved specifically for this purpose. As the walls rose, Werner embedded flat stones at regular intervals within the clay matrix. These stones served dual purposes. They added structural reinforcement, creating a composite material stronger than clay alone. They also added thermal mass, increasing the structure's total heat storage capacity. His father had used this technique in Bavaria, and Werner adapted it to frontier materials. After 5 days of patient work, the first level was complete. Werner stepped back and examined his progress. The structure looked crude compared to the finished tile stoves of his youth, but the fundamental engineering was sound. Thick walls, integrated stone reinforcement, and careful attention to load-bearing requirements created a base that would support the complex structure he planned to build above it. Virgil Preston visited during this phase, curious about what Werner was building. Virgil was different from Silas. He was younger, less certain of his own knowledge, and more willing to observe without immediate judgment. He examined the wood storage compartment and asked intelligent questions about its purpose. Werner explained the pre-warming principle, how storing wood in rising heat would drive out moisture and increase combustion efficiency. Virgil seemed genuinely interested but uncertain. He asked if Werner was sure this would work, if he had built such stoves before. Werner admitted he had only assisted his father, that this was his first independent construction. Virgil's expression showed doubt, but he didn't mock. He simply said he hoped it worked, and that Werner hadn't wasted his summer on an experiment that would fail. After Virgil left, Werner continued his work. He needed to let the first level cure for at least a week before building the second level. Adding weight too quickly would compress the still damp clay below, causing distortion and potential cracking. Construction required patience, allowing proper curing time between phases. Werner used this waiting period productively, preparing materials for the critical second level that would contain the firebox and baking oven. The second level represented the heart of Werner's design. This section would contain both the primary firebox and the side baking oven, sharing thermal mass and operating at the same vertical height. The engineering challenge was creating 2 functional chambers that utilized heat efficiently while maintaining structural integrity. Werner spent 3 days reviewing his notes and sketches before beginning construction, ensuring he understood every detail of what he planned to build. He started by building the external walls upward from the first level, maintaining the 6-inch thickness that provided necessary thermal mass. As these walls rose 12 inches, Werner began forming the internal divisions that would separate the firebox from the baking oven. This internal wall was critical. It needed to be thick enough to serve as thermal mass, allowing heat from the firebox to radiate into the baking oven chamber, but not so thick that it consumed excessive interior space. Werner settled on 4 inches for the dividing wall. He built it carefully, ensuring perfect vertical alignment and smooth surfaces. The clay mixture for this wall included slightly more sand than his standard formula, providing additional structural strength since this wall would bear load from above while experiencing extreme temperature differentials between the firebox side and oven side. The firebox chamber occupied the front position, where Werner could easily access it for loading fuel and managing combustion. He formed this chamber with meticulous attention to dimensions: 14 inches wide, 16 inches deep, and 12 inches tall, large enough to hold substantial fuel loads, small enough to concentrate heat effectively. The floor of the firebox was formed from flat stones embedded in clay, creating a surface that could withstand direct flame contact for years. Werner created the firebox opening using another carefully carved wooden form, shaping an arched entrance 10 inches wide and 8 inches tall. This opening would eventually receive a metal door, one of the few manufactured components he planned to incorporate. For now, the wooden form held the arch's shape while the surrounding clay cured. The baking oven chamber beside the firebox required equally careful construction. Werner formed this space with an interior that measured 12 inches wide, 14 inches deep and 10 inches tall, slightly smaller than the firebox but adequate for baking bread and cooking food. The oven's opening faced the side of the stove, positioned where Werner could access it easily while the firebox operated. The most crucial element was the air path Werner created at the base of the dividing wall. He formed a narrow channel, just 2 inches tall, connecting the firebox to the baking oven at floor level. This channel would allow hot air to flow from the firebox into the oven, heating it through convection, while the radiant heat from the shared thermal mass wall provided additional warmth. As Werner worked on this level, Silas arrived with a larger group of trappers, perhaps 6 or 7 men who had heard about Hauptmann's strange construction project. They stood watching as Werner carefully shaped the clay, forming chambers and passages with obvious precision. With both chambers of the second level formed, Werner faced his most challenging task, creating the internal flue system that would capture heat before allowing exhaust gases to escape. This invisible architecture would determine whether his stove succeeded or failed. The principle was elegant, but required precise execution. Hot gases naturally rise, seeking the path of least resistance. Werner's challenge was forcing those gases through a longer, serpentine path that maximized contact with thermal mass. He began by forming a channel at the rear of the firebox chamber. This channel, 3 inches wide and 4 inches tall, would receive the initial flow of hot exhaust. Instead of allowing gases to rise directly upward, Werner directed this channel horizontally along the back wall of the stove. The channel traveled the full width of the structure before reaching the opposite corner. At this corner, Werner formed a vertical rise, allowing gases to ascend 8 inches before encountering another horizontal channel. This second passage ran back across the stove in the opposite direction, creating the first segment of the serpentine path. The gases would travel back and forth, losing heat to the surrounding clay at each turn. The construction was technically demanding. Werner needed to maintain consistent channel dimensions while building clay walls around empty space. He used temporary wooden forms, carefully carved pieces that supported the clay until it achieved sufficient strength to maintain its shape. These forms would eventually burn away during the first firing, but they were essential during construction. He created 3 complete horizontal passes within the stove's mass, each separated by vertical rises. The total path length from firebox to final exit was approximately 12 feet, despite the stove's compact exterior dimensions. Every foot of that path represented surface area where hot gases would contact cool clay, transferring thermal energy that would later radiate into the cabin. The most critical aspect was maintaining proper draft. The channels needed to allow gases to flow freely without creating back pressure that could force smoke into the cabin. Werner calculated the necessary cross-sectional area based on principles his father had taught, ensuring adequate flow while maximizing surface contact. Silas arrived during this phase with his usual entourage of skeptics. He examined the external walls rising above the firebox level and asked where the chimney was. Werner explained he was building internal heat capture channels before the gases would eventually exit. Silas demanded to know why anyone would make smoke travel through a maze instead of simply letting it go straight up a chimney. Werner attempted to explain heat transfer principles, how gases carried thermal energy that was wasted if allowed to escape immediately. Silas interrupted, declaring this was the stupidest idea he had encountered in 12 years of mountain living. He predicted the entire structure would fill with smoke on the first firing, that Werner would choke on the fumes from his own cleverness. The other trappers agreed enthusiastically. One suggested Werner was building an oven that would cook him instead of his food. Another said Hauptmann's monument was becoming more impressive and more useless with each passing week. Werner continued working, carefully removing the temporary forms as each section cured, inspecting the internal channels to ensure they were smooth and unobstructed. With the internal flue pathways complete and properly cured, Werner began construction of the third level. This section would provide active cooking capability directly above the firebox while creating additional thermal mass for heat storage. The engineering challenge was integrating functional cooking surfaces with the serpentine flue system he had built below, ensuring hot gases completed their heat transfer journey before finally exiting through the chimney. Werner built the external walls, upward, maintaining his standard 6-inch thickness. As these walls rose another 12 inches, he carefully formed the top of the internal flue channels, creating a sealed upper surface for the serpentine passages below. This surface would become searingly hot during firing as exhaust gases traveled beneath it, making it ideal for cooking applications that required sustained high heat. At the front center position, directly above the firebox, Werner created a flat cooking surface approximately 10 inches square. He formed this area using his densest clay mixture, reinforced with flat stones that would distribute heat evenly. This surface would reach temperatures sufficient for boiling water or frying food within minutes of lighting the firebox. The direct vertical alignment with the combustion chamber below ensured maximum heat transfer to this primary cooking area. To the side of this central cooking position, Werner built a raised platform with recessed areas sized to hold standard cooking pots. This warming zone would benefit from radiant heat rising through the stove's mass without experiencing the intense temperatures of the direct cooking surface. Food could simmer here for hours, or prepared meals could be kept warm without burning. The flue gases, having traveled through their serpentine path and transferred most of their thermal energy to the surrounding mass, finally needed an exit route. Werner formed a vertical chimney channel at the rear corner of the stove, positioned to receive the cooled exhaust after its complete journey through the heat capture system. This chimney would rise through the 4th level and eventually through the cabin roof. The 4th and topmost level was simpler in construction, but equally important functionally. Werner built the walls up another 14 inches, creating a final chamber that would serve primarily as storage space. The top of the stove, nearly 7 feet above the cabin floor, would be the warmest and driest area in the entire structure, perfect for storing cooking vessels, keeping them dry and ready for use, or for drying herbs and other materials that benefited from gentle, sustained heat. Werner formed a flat top surface for this uppermost level, creating a final platform where copper pots and vessels could rest. The chimney continued upward through this level, exiting at the very top of the structure. He shaped the chimney opening carefully, creating a socket that would eventually receive an exterior chimney pipe extending through the roof. As the structure reached its full height, dominating the cabin interior, the mockery from neighboring trappers intensified. Silas brought visitors specifically to marvel at Hauptmann's monument to stupidity. The massive clay structure occupied nearly a quarter of the cabin's interior space. Men stood outside and stared through the window at the enormous construction, shaking their heads in disbelief. One trapper calculated that Werner had spent at least 8 weeks on construction when a serviceable stone fireplace required 3 days. Another noted the hundreds of pounds of clay Werner had hauled from the creek bank. Werner allowed the completed structure to cure for 2 full weeks before attempting his first firing. During this time, he constructed the exterior chimney that would carry exhaust above the roofline, carefully sealing the penetration through the cabin roof to prevent water infiltration. He installed a metal door for the firebox, using iron hinges and a simple latch mechanism. He built a smaller metal door for the baking oven. The stove was ready for testing. On September 23, 1852, Werner loaded the firebox with kindling and small branches, building a modest fire to begin the curing process. Large fires in brand-new masonry could cause thermal shock and cracking. The initial firings needed to be gentle, gradually driving residual moisture from the clay while avoiding sudden temperature extremes. Werner lit the kindling and stepped back to observe. Smoke rose from the fire as expected. For approximately 30 seconds, everything appeared to function correctly. Then smoke began seeping from gaps in the clay structure. Within 2 minutes, the entire cabin filled with acrid smoke. Werner opened the door and windows, grabbed a bucket of water, and extinguished the fire. He stood outside coughing, watching smoke pour from his cabin, understanding that something in his design had failed catastrophically. Silas arrived within an hour, somehow having learned of the disaster with remarkable speed. He stood laughing openly while Werner examined the smoking structure. Silas declared that anyone with common sense could have predicted this outcome, that complicated foreign designs were useless compared to simple American methods, and that Werner should tear down his monument and build a proper fireplace before winter. Werner didn't respond. He was analyzing the failure, trying to understand what had gone wrong. The smoke had seeped from the structure at the third level, suggesting the internal flue channels had failed to maintain draft. Either the channels were blocked, too narrow, or improperly configured to allow adequate flow. Without proper draft, combustion gases had no path to follow and simply permeated through the clay structure wherever they could. Over the next 3 days, Werner carefully dismantled the third level, exposing the internal flue channels he had built weeks earlier. He discovered his error immediately. One of the horizontal passages had partially collapsed during construction or curing, creating a restriction that blocked flow. The serpentine path, instead of guiding gases through the thermal mass, had created a dead end that forced smoke to find alternative routes through the porous clay. Werner rebuilt the affected section, this time using additional temporary supports to ensure the channels maintained their shape during curing. He also increased the cross-sectional area of each passage slightly, providing more margin for error and ensuring adequate draft even if minor irregularities existed. The repairs took a full week, during which Silas visited twice to remind Werner that simple designs didn't require complicated repairs. By early October, Werner was ready for a second attempt. He built another small fire, watching intently as smoke began to rise. This time the smoke traveled properly through the internal channels and exited through the chimney. No smoke seeped from the structure. The draft was strong and consistent. Werner maintained the small fire for 3 hours, monitoring every aspect of the stove's performance. Werner conducted a series of controlled tests over the following 2 weeks, gradually increasing fire intensity while documenting the stove's thermal performance. Each test provided data about how his creation actually functioned compared to his theoretical calculations. The results exceeded his expectations in some areas and revealed necessary adjustments in others. During the first substantial firing, Werner loaded the firebox with seasoned pine and allowed it to burn hot for 2 hours. He used his expensive thermometer to measure temperatures at various locations on the stove's exterior surface. The cooking surface directly above the firebox reached 380 degrees. The side warming areas measured 220 degrees. The upper storage level maintained 160 degrees. The external walls averaged 140 degrees throughout. After the fire consumed all its fuel and died to coals, Werner closed the firebox door and dampers, sealing the system. Then he monitored how long the heat lasted. The cooking surface remained above 200 degrees for 6 hours. The side warming areas stayed hot enough to keep food warm for 12 hours. The external walls continued radiating comfortable warmth for 18 hours after the fire had completely extinguished. Werner placed a pot of water on the cooking surface 8 hours after the fire had died. The water heated to a simmer within 20 minutes, demonstrating that the stored thermal energy remained functionally useful long after active combustion ceased. He placed bread dough in the side baking oven 10 hours after firing. The bread baked properly over the next hour, achieving golden crust and fully cooked interior. The efficiency compared to his old fireplace was dramatic. The fireplace had required constant feeding, consuming a full cord of wood every 10 days during cold weather while providing heat only within a few feet of the flames. Werner's stove used approximately one-fifth the wood while heating the entire cabin uniformly. The difference wasn't marginal. It was revolutionary, but Werner kept his success quiet. He continued his normal trapping activities, checking lines and processing pelts as autumn progressed into early winter. When other trappers visited, they saw the massive stove, but Werner offered no demonstrations or explanations. Silas continued making jokes about Hauptmann's monument, assuming the structure was decorative rather than functional since Werner never seemed to use it conspicuously. In reality, Werner fired the stove once each morning, a practice that became routine. He would load the firebox with hardwood, burn it hot for 2 to 3 hours while preparing breakfast and organizing his day's work, then close the dampers and leave for his trap lines. When he returned in the evening, the cabin remained warm. The stove's surface was still hot enough for cooking dinner. Overnight, the radiant heat kept interior temperatures comfortable while he slept. Virgil Preston visited in early November and noticed the cabin's warmth despite no visible fire. He asked Werner directly if the stove worked as intended. Werner confirmed it did, but offered no elaboration. Virgil examined the structure more carefully, touching surfaces that were warm throughout, seeing bread baking in the side oven, observing pots simmering on the upper levels. His expression showed impressed confusion, but he said nothing more. Winter arrived early in 1852, repeating the pattern that had killed Ernst the previous year. Snow began falling in mid-November with unusual intensity, and temperatures dropped steadily through December. By the first week of January 1853, the Montana wilderness was locked in brutal cold that tested every structure and every man who had chosen to winter in the mountains. The temperature fell to 20 below zero on January 7th, then 30 below on January 9th. On January 11th, Werner's thermometer registered 42 degrees below zero at dawn, and the temperature never rose above 35 below throughout the day. These were survival conditions that pushed frontier construction methods to their absolute limits. Werner maintained his routine. Each morning, he fired his stove for 2 to 3 hours, loading the firebox with dense hardwood that burned hot and clean. The massive thermal mass absorbed heat with patient efficiency, storing energy that would sustain comfortable temperatures for the next 24 hours. His cabin interior remained between 65 and 70 degrees throughout the cold snap. He worked in shirt sleeves, slept without excessive furs, and continued his daily activities without the desperate struggle against cold that characterized winter survival for most mountain men. Other trappers faced a different reality. Silas Blackwood's cabin, built with standard construction and heated by a conventional stone fireplace, became a desperate battlefield against the cold. Silas burned wood continuously, feeding his fireplace every 2 hours throughout the day and night. The fire consumed enormous quantities of fuel, yet the cabin's interior barely reached 30 degrees, even with flames roaring constantly. The fireplace threw heat directly outward in a narrow cone, leaving the majority of the cabin frozen. Moisture from breathing and cooking condensed on the walls and froze instantly, creating layers of interior ice. Silas slept in every fur he owned, positioned as close to the fireplace as possible without risking burns. He still woke shivering every few hours to feed more wood into the insatiable flames. By the third day of 40 below temperatures, Silas had depleted his carefully prepared woodpile by half. At his current consumption rate, he would run out of firewood within a week, facing the choice of leaving the cabin to cut more wood in deadly cold or allowing his fire to die and accepting the consequences. Other trappers throughout the region faced similar calculations. Virgil Preston's situation was equally desperate. His cabin was slightly better insulated than Silas's, but his smaller fireplace provided even less heat. Virgil spent the cold snap essentially living inside his fireplace alcove, leaving that warm zone only when absolutely necessary. His water bucket froze solid despite sitting 5 feet from the fire. His food supplies, stored against the cabin's outer walls, froze hard as stone. On the evening of January 13th, with temperatures still hovering at 38 below zero, Silas Blackwood made a decision that would validate everything Werner had built. He bundled himself in furs, left his cabin with its roaring fire, and walked through the frozen darkness to Werner Hauptmann's cabin. The journey of less than half a mile in that cold was genuinely dangerous, but Silas had reached the point where pride mattered less than survival. Silas knocked on Werner's door with hands so cold he could barely form a fist. Werner opened the door immediately, and warm air rushed out into the frozen night. Silas stepped inside and stopped, stunned by what he encountered. The cabin interior was genuinely warm, not the barely tolerable cold that passed for heated space in frontier winters. Werner stood in a simple wool shirt, no furs, no excessive layers, completely comfortable. Silas looked at the massive clay stove. No fire burned in the visible firebox. The structure appeared cold and inactive, yet the cabin was warmer than Silas's had been in 3 days, despite his continuous fire. Silas asked how this was possible. Werner explained he had fired the stove that morning for 2 hours and hadn't touched it since. Silas insisted Werner was lying, that no fire could keep a cabin warm for 14 hours in 40 below temperatures. Werner walked to the stove and invited Silas to touch its surface. Silas placed his frozen hand against the clay wall and jerked back from the heat. The entire structure radiated warmth, every surface contributing to the cabin's temperature. Werner pointed to bread baking in the side oven, dough that had been placed there an hour earlier. He showed Silas a pot on the upper warming platform where stew simmered, gently, cooking without any visible flame. Silas stood silently, processing what he was witnessing. His own cabin, with a fire that had burned constantly for 72 hours, maintained interior temperatures around 20 to 25 degrees. Werner's cabin, with a stove that hadn't been fired in 14 hours, maintained temperatures near 70 degrees. The differential was 45 to 50 degrees, and it demolished every assumption Silas held about heating and survival. Werner offered Silas coffee and food, both heated by the stove's residual warmth. As Silas thawed and ate, Werner explained the principles behind his design. The massive clay structure absorbed heat during the morning firing, storing tremendous thermal energy in hundreds of pounds of material. The internal flue channels forced hot exhaust gases through 12 feet of serpentine path, transferring heat that would otherwise escape up a chimney. The result was extreme efficiency, capturing 70 to 80% of combustion energy instead of losing it. Silas asked how much wood Werner burned. Werner showed him his modest wood pile and explained he used approximately 1 cord of wood every 40 days. Silas was burning 1 cord every 8 to 10 days and barely surviving. The efficiency advantage was 6 to 1, and it meant the difference between desperate fuel consumption and comfortable sustainability. As Silas prepared to return to his own cabin, he asked Werner directly if he would teach this construction method to others. Werner said he would share everything he knew with anyone who wanted to learn. Silas nodded slowly, then admitted he had been wrong. He had mocked Werner's efforts, called his stove a monument to stupidity, and dismissed foreign knowledge as useless. The 40 below temperatures had proven otherwise. Engineering mattered more than tradition. Word spread through the trapping community with remarkable speed. Within a week of Silas's visit, Werner received a steady stream of trappers asking to examine his stove and learn how it was built. Men who had mocked the construction now stood respectfully silent, touching the warm surfaces, observing the bread baking and pots simmering, understanding that they had witnessed innovation born from necessity and knowledge. Virgil Preston arrived with a detailed request. He wanted Werner to help him build an identical stove in his own cabin. He offered to pay Werner for his time and expertise, to provide whatever labor Werner needed, to follow instructions exactly as given. Werner agreed but refused payment. He would help Virgil because Ernst Hoffmann had died in a cold cabin, and if Werner's knowledge could prevent other deaths, sharing it was obligation, not business. The construction of Virgil's stove began in late January during a brief warming period when temperatures rose to merely 10 below zero. Werner brought his tools and materials, and he taught Virgil the entire process from foundation to such a final chimney. They excavated the foundation together, with Werner explaining load calculations and settlement prevention. They hauled clay from Werner's proven deposit, with Werner teaching how to identify good material by texture and plasticity. The building process took 5 weeks, slower than Werner's original construction because teaching required additional time for explanation and demonstration. Werner showed Virgil how to mix clay, sand, and straw in proper ratios. He explained thermal mass principles and heat transfer physics in practical terms that a trapper with no formal education could understand. He demonstrated how to build the internal flue channels using temporary forms and patient layering techniques. Other trappers visited during construction, watching the process and asking questions. Werner answered everything openly, sometimes sketching diagrams in the dirt, to illustrate principles that were difficult to convey with words alone. Some men took notes, others simply watched and absorbed information through observation. Silas Blackwood arrived in mid-February and surprised everyone by apologizing publicly to Werner. He admitted he had been wrong to mock Werner's efforts, wrong to dismiss knowledge from different traditions, and wrong to assume that American methods were automatically superior. He asked if Werner would help him build a similar stove. Werner agreed. By early March, 3 stoves were under construction in different cabins throughout the region. Werner traveled between sites, checking progress, correcting errors, teaching refinements he had learned through his own experience. The trappers building these stoves were careful students, understanding that their winter survival might depend on getting the details right. Virgil's stove was completed in early March and tested successfully. The performance matched Werner's original heating Virgil's cabin to comfortable temperatures with minimal wood consumption. Virgil expressed gratitude. That went beyond words, understanding that Werner had given him knowledge that would fundamentally change his frontier experience. By the time spring arrived and trapping season resumed, 7 stoves were completed or under construction. The design became known among trappers as a Hauptmann stove, named for the German immigrant who had brought Bavarian heating technology to the Montana wilderness. Werner Hauptmann continued trapping through the 1850s, eventually saving enough money to purchase a small ranch in the Oregon Territory. He left the mountains in 1859, married a widow named Catherine Mueller in 1860, and lived quietly as a rancher and occasional mason. He built several more heating stoves for settlers in Oregon, always using his proven design, always refusing to profit excessively from knowledge he considered essential for survival. He died in 1879 at age 54 from pneumonia, the same disease that had killed Ernst Hoffmann. Catherine buried him on their ranch property under an oak tree he had planted years earlier. His gravestone listed his name and dates, but made no mention of his innovation or the lives his knowledge had saved. But in the mountains of Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakota Territories, Werner's legacy persisted in physical form. The stoves he had built continued functioning decades after his death, their massive thermal mass still absorbing and radiating heat with the efficiency he had engineered. Trappers who had never met Werner built variations of his design, passing construction knowledge to newcomers through demonstration and explanation. The name Hauptmann stove eventually faded from common use, replaced by generic terms like masonry heater or thermal mass stove. But the essential principles Werner had introduced remained embedded in frontier construction practices. Settlers moving west in the 1860s and 70s encountered these designs and recognized their superiority. Some built their own versions. Others hired masons familiar with the technique. By the 1880s, variations of Werner's design appeared throughout the northern frontier, each adapted to local materials and specific needs, but all sharing the fundamental architecture he had developed. Thick thermal mass walls, serpentine internal flue paths, multi-level functionality. The engineering that had seemed foreign and unnecessarily complex in 1852 became accepted wisdom by 1880. Modern historians studying frontier survival and construction methods occasionally encounter references to these early masonry heaters, noting their sophisticated engineering and efficiency advantages. Few historical records mention Werner Hauptmann by name. His innovation spread organically through demonstration and necessity rather than through formal documentation or patent protection. The story of Werner's stove illustrates a fundamental truth about frontier innovation. The best solutions often came from adapting knowledge from other cultures and traditions rather than assuming that established American methods were optimal. Werner didn't invent thermal mass heating. He simply recognized that Bavarian technology, developed over centuries to survive alpine winters, could be adapted to Montana conditions using local materials and frontier construction methods. His legacy wasn't fame or wealth. It was warmth in cabins scattered across thousands of miles of wilderness, fuel efficiency that made winter survival sustainable rather than desperate, and the quiet satisfaction of solving a problem that had killed his closest friend.